From the seasoned vaults of storytelling, where truth meets trembling silence, where legacy collides with injustice, and where history isn't just remembered, but relived. Welcome to A1 Storyteller. Here, we don't simply tell stories. We resurrect the moments the world tried to forget, the voices nearly silenced by fear, and the hearts bruised by time, but still beating with purpose. Today's journey isn't a tale of fiction, it's a reckoning. Picture this. A quiet afternoon sun spills through a diner window, casting shadows across a plate of peach cobbler. A man, dignified, composed, quietly present, lifts a spoon, unaware that within moments, a gun will be pointed at his chest. Not because of a crime, not because of a threat, but because of the color of his skin. What the officer didn't know, what almost cost the town its conscience, was the man before him had spent his life upholding the law, defending liberty, and sitting on the highest seat of justice this county had ever known. This isn't just a story of a racist cop and an elderly black man. It's a collision between the past and the present, between what America thinks it is and what it still is for far too many. And you're about to witness every breath of it unfold. Raw, unfiltered, unforgettable. This is Racist Cop Pulls Gun on Elderly Black Man at Lunch. They had no idea who he was. Told only as a one storyteller can. With soul, with fire, and with the weight of 100 years of truth wrapped in one moment you'll never forget. It was the kind of southern Sunday that made the world feel still, sunlight tumbling through Spanish moss like golden silk, the soft clinking of church bells echoing through cobblestone alleys. The Magnolia Grill sat tucked beneath a row of ancient oak trees, its red and white awning fluttering gently in the breeze. Inside, life moved in slow rhythms. Families bowed their heads in prayer before plates of shrimp and grits. Laughter floated on the scent of buttered cornbread. At a corner table by the window, the door creaked open and silence swept the room. Not hostile, just curious. He stepped in, tall, straight back despite the years pressed into his frame. His blazer, navy and tailored, held the kind of quiet authority that demanded no introduction. His skin was deep and smooth, marked by time but unmarred by regret. His eyes scanned the room, not seeking approval, just gauging space. A whisper of recognition moved through the staff. Not by name, not yet, just something in the way. He carried himself like a cathedral in motion. He took his seat by the window. The waitress brought him coffee without asking, placing it gently with a respectful nod. He offered a small smile, reached into his leather bag, and pulled out a worn journal, the kind bound with stories no one else had read. He wrote slowly. The world outside mirrored in the page. Across the street, the patrol car idled, 2 officers inside. One watching the scene through narrowed eyes, suspicious of serenity. In a town where the ghosts of history still lingered beneath polished cobblestones, sometimes all it took was a man sitting quietly to stir up an old storm. In the humming silence of the cruiser, dispatch crackled. A vague alert. Suspicious black male, late 60s. Seen pacing along storefronts, possibly casing shops. No mention of. Door rang again. The officer stepped in. The energy in the room dropped a few degrees. Children fell silent. Forks paused midair. The waitress, still holding the coffee pot, froze in place. Croft's boots echoed on the linoleum as he approached the table. The man looked up. No fear. Just a quiet, unsettling calm, the kind that unnerved even the most trained instincts. "Sir," Croft said, his voice dry, already braced for confrontation. "I'm going to need to see some ID." There was no escalation, no raised voice. The man blinked slowly, placed his pen down, and reached toward his coat pocket. A single moment, a breath, a decision. Croft's hand flew to his holster. The next beat would ripple across a nation. The stillness that followed the officer's command held the diner in a vice grip. Every soul in the room seemed to forge how to breathe. Mothers instinctively pulled their children closer. An elderly couple near the back leaned into each other. The clatter of silverware and hum of kitchen fryers faded beneath the thick weight of unspoken fear. The man at the window remained motionless for a heartbeat, then another. Then, with slow deliberation, he set his pen down beside his open journal. He looked up, straight into the eyes of Officer Croft, and something in his gaze made the young officer hesitate. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't arrogance. It was something older, something deeper, an exhausted kind of knowing. Like a man who had lived this scene 1,000 times in his bones, long before it ever unfolded in flesh. "I'm reaching for my wallet," the man said, his voice low but clear, each syllable wrapped in calm precision. He moved like some OE trained to stay alive, like someone who knew that in a world that mistook confidence for threat, a sudden move could sign your obituary. Still, Croft's hand hovered dangerously over his weapon, tension throbbing down his arm like a pulse of heat. His eyes darted to the man's jacket pocket, his brain racing ahead, conjuring scenarios taught in academy drills and reinforced through viral footage. Comply, they had said. But stay ready. The contradiction had never felt more fragile. The man drew out a slim brown leather wallet and placed it gently on the table. Then he folded his hands on the wood. "You're welcome to look," he said. Croft didn't move. His partner shifted uneasily behind him, glancing around at the silent audience. A few patrons had begun filming on their phones, their faces stricken with disbelief. Croft heard the low electronic chirp of a camera shutter, the click of someone's screen lock disengaging. And that sound, sharp and intimate, dug beneath his skin. He stepped forward and reached for the wallet. Inside, instead of a driver's license, was a federal judge's ID, Judge Elijah Monroe, retired, Circuit Court of Appeals. Embossed gold letters glinted faintly under the harsh diner lights. Croft stared at it longer than he needed to, longer than anyone expected. The badge beside the ID gleamed, polished, not for display, but because it had been held worn, used in moments of consequence. Croft's mouth went dry. His heart stammered behind his ribs. Behind him, a gasp rippled through the restaurant, but Judge Monroe didn't flinch, didn't gloat, didn't move to reclaim his wallet. He simply tilted his head slightly and asked, "What exactly do you think I was about to do?" Croft tried to answer, but his tongue stumbled on words that had lost their meaning. His partner took a small step back. Outside, a crow cawed from a distant power line. Inside, every soul waited. Judge Monroe slowly leaned back in his seat. "I'm 78 years old. I've prosecuted murderers, advised 2 presidents, helped write 4 state justice reform proposals. And this morning, all I wanted was my favorite peach cobbler and coffee. But to you, I was dangerous enough to draw your weapon." "Why?" Croft's face flushed. But it wasn't anger. It was the shame of being seen too clearly. Sir, Monroe cut in gently, not harsh, not vengeful. "Son, don't call me sir if you don't see me as one." The words fell like a sermon, not loud but heavy. Behind the counter, the waitress wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron. The cook peeked through the kitchen window, lips pressed in a hard line. The tension no longer belonged only to Monroe and Croft. It belonged to everyone in that room. The invisible weight of history pressing down on every shoulder. "Well, I didn't know who you were," Croft said quietly, like an apology that had forgotten how to stand upright. "But you did?" Monroe replied, his tone still even. "You knew who I was the moment you saw me. You just didn't know the title." Croft took a step back, the wallet still in his hand, unsure what to do with it now. He felt hollow, like something had drained out of him. A lesson taught too late. A moment of clarity no academy could have prepared him for. Monroe reached forward, gently retrieving his wallet without looking away from Croft's eyes. Then he added, "If I had raised my voice, if I had asked why, if I had moved even a second too fast, what would have happened?" The question hovered between them, unanswerable yet undeniable. Croft didn't respond. He couldn't. His partner touched his arm, gently, a gesture less about duty and more about grounding. A reminder that they were still being watched, still in the middle of something they had never been trained to handle. Monroe lifted his coffee cup, took a slow sip, then set it back down. "That fear you felt when I reached for my wallet? That's the fear I feel every time I see blue lights behind me. The only difference is I've done nothing wrong, and I still wonder if I'll live through it." There was no accusation in his voice, just truth, raw, undeniable. Croft swallowed hard. He looked around the room and saw judgment, not in words or gestures, but in the silence. The same silence that followed the sound of a verdict in a courtroom. A hush that didn't need to be explained. He turned, muttered something to his partner, and the two officers walked out slowly. No dramatic exits, no slammed doors, just the weighted departure of men who knew they had been changed, though perhaps not yet enough. As the door swung shut behind them, the air inside the Magnolia Grill didn't release right away. It lingered, thick and reverent. Monroe remained seated. He looked out the window at the moss-draped trees as if searching for something softer than memory. The waitress returned to his table. Her hands trembled as she refilled his coffee. "Your cobbler's on the house today," she said, barely above a whisper. He offered a small nod, then returned to his journal. Ink bled softly onto the page as he began to write again, the words forming under a hand that had once signed rulings that would change the course of lives. He paused for a moment, glanced out the window one more time, then continued. As though capturing this moment not for himself, but for the world that would one day need to remember what it had almost done. The Magnolia Grill slowly returned to motion, though not quite to normal. Conversations resumed, but in softened tone. The clatter of dishes and the shuffle of footsteps took on a reverence, as though the walls themselves had borne witness to something sacred and terrifying. Judge Monroe remained at his table, a quiet island amid the ripples of aftershock. He stirred his coffee slowly, gaze drifting between the half-eaten slice of cobbler before him and the world just beyond the diner window. There was no triumph in his posture, no vindication. Only the enduring silence of a man who had spent a lifetime swallowing moments like this one. Outside, Officer Croft sat behind the wheel of the squad car, eyes locked forward, hands limp on his thighs. His partner said nothing. The cruiser felt like a confessional, thick with the weight of something unspoken. Croft replayed it over and over, the slow reach for the wallet, the glint of the badge, the stare that had looked straight through him, like he was still wearing training blues. He thought of the man's words. The way they had slipped past his defenses, not as accusations, but as truths he couldn't shake. His hands trembled, though he hadn't noticed until his partner gently placed a palm on his shoulder. "You good?" his partner asked. Croft didn't answer, not because he was unwilling. Because he didn't know. Good wasn't something you could claim after almost pulling a weapon on a federal judge for the crime of having dark skin and drinking coffee. Back in the diner, the waitress leaned against the counter, arms folded tightly across her chest. She'd seen things in her 30 years, slinging plates and pouring coffee, but nothing like that. She thought of her father, a proud man who used to wear his Sunday best just to go to the voting station in 1965, who had been stopped more times than she could count for, fitting a description. She thought of how many men like Judge Monroe had lived quiet, dignified lives, only to be reduced to a threat in an instant. When Monroe stood, his body moved with quiet restraint. Not stiffness, but control. The kind of bearing learned over decades in courtrooms, in policy chambers, in streets that looked just like this one. He walked to the register. The cashier, a teenage boy with acne and a college hoodie, fumbled with the machine, his eyes too wide, too aware of who stood before him. "It's on the house, sir," he mumbled. Monroe raised a brow. "Then I'll leave the cost in tip." He placed a 20 on the counter, folded with precision, and nodded once before turning toward the door. The bell chimed as he stepped outside into the afternoon light. The sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. He paused, drawing a slow breath, savoring the warmth on his skin. Across the street, the cruiser was still there. Croft inside, head bowed slightly. Monroe didn't look away. He stood there, his gaze resting on the car, not in challenge, but in reflection. Croft finally looked up. Their eyes met through the windshield. Two men on opposite sides of a thin, invisible line drawn by centuries of blood and silence. There was no exchange, no nod, no gesture of understanding, only the recognition of something heavy they now both carried. Monroe turned and walked down the street. His cane clicked against the pavement, a metronome of resilience. Each step was steady. Each step belonged to a man who had marched in Selma and argued law in Washington and buried friends who didn't make it to either. He carried their names in his spine, in the scars hidden beneath the fabric of his dignity. A few blocks away stood the courthouse where he'd once served, a relic of pale stone and grand pillars towering over the square like a monument to the law's promise and its betrayal. He didn't look toward it as he passed, not because he resented it, but because he had outlived the need to be acknowledged by marble and glass. He made his way to a park bench just beyond the town's library. Children played in the distance, laughter ringing out beneath the canopy of old trees. He sat down slowly, setting his journal beside him. A breeze carried the faint scent of magnolia blossoms. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let himself breathe fully for the first time that day. In the diner, the story began to spread, not just through whispers, but through screens. A young woman at a nearby table had filmed the entire encounter on her phone. She hadn't meant to be a witness to history, just brunch with her sister. But now her hands shook as she rewatched the footage. The stillness of the judge, the tension in the officer's jaw, the reveal of the badge. She didn't post it out of malice or clout chasing. She posted it because she couldn't not. Because what she had seen demanded to be seen again. Within hours, the video climbed through the algorithms, first among local circles, then further. The caption read simply, "He never raised his voice. He didn't have to." Comment sections flooded with outrage, disbelief, sorrow. People across the country watched and rewatched that moment, where history, bias, restraint, and grace collided in a small-town diner on a Sunday afternoon. Some saw their fathers in Monroe. Others saw themselves in Croft and hated that truth. Many saw both, and it broke them open. In a precinct office just outside of town, the police chief stared at the video with hands pressed to his temples, his face pale, his eyes unfocused. Officer Croft had returned to file a report, but the paperwork sat untouched. What was there to write? How do you describe pulling your weapon on dignity in human form? The chief clicked replay again, watching Monroe's hand move slowly toward his pocket, watching Croft's instinct lurch to violence, watching the moment buckle and break. Then he picked up the phone and called an emergency meeting. In the living room of a modest brick house, a boy no older than 15 stared at the screen, wide-eyed. His mother had told him stories like this. His uncle had warned him what to do when stopped, where to put his hands, how to speak softly, how to survive. He had nodded, too young to understand why a wallet could be more dangerous than a weapon. Now he understood, too well. Across the country, the image of Judge Monroe became something more than a viral moment. He became a symbol, not of what had happened, but of what so nearly did. Of what always could. His story threaded through living rooms, newsrooms, classrooms. It sparked sermons, town halls, long silences between fathers and sons. It raised questions that no one could unask. In the park, Monroe sat quietly, unaware of how far his presence had already traveled. His journal lay open beside him, the ink still fresh from that morning's entry. The lines on the page danced slightly in the wind, catching fragments of sunlight as they lifted and settled. He did not know the girl had posted the video. He did not know his name would soon be on headlines. All he knew in that moment was that he was alive, still here, still writing, still watching the world try to learn. In a quiet corner of his modest home, Judge Monroe sat by the window as twilight descended, bathing the room in hues of amber and indigo. The day's events had not left him. They clung to his thoughts like the faint scent of gun oil that still lingered in his memory. He had seen injustice in courtrooms, in legislation, in whispered deals behind closed doors, but there was something different about this. It was personal in a way he hadn't felt in decades, not because it was unexpected, but because it was so familiar it hurt. He opened his journal again, this time not as a judge, but as a black man in America, older now, tired in places even sleep couldn't reach. His hand trembled slightly as he wrote, not from fear but from the weight of restraint he had carried all day. The questions haunted him. How many others hadn't made it to write this entry? How many sons and brothers and fathers never came home because someone mistook their presence for threat? His pen scratched on the page, pouring out not a speech or a ruling, but a quiet elegy for the dignity that is forced to wear armor every day it steps outside. Miles away, Officer Croft sat alone in the locker room, his uniform hanging limply from his frame like a skin he no longer knew how to wear. The silence wasn't peaceful. It gnawed at him. The judge's words kept replaying, each one more piercing than the last. "Don't call me sir if you don't see me as one." That sentence, so calm, had unspooled something inside him, something brittle and buried. Croft thought of his father, a former Marine, and how he'd preached law and order over dinner tables. How he'd warned him that softness was weakness. But now, all Croft could feel was hollow. He stared at his reflection in the mirror, seeing not an enforcer of justice, but a man who'd nearly become the story he'd sworn to prevent. The badge felt heavier now, as if it knew. He hadn't spoken to anyone since returning. What could he say? Sorry. Sorry? That word had no purchase in a world where a trigger could rewrite someone's entire story in less than a second. In the quiet hours before dawn, Judge Monroe stood at his bathroom mirror, shirt unbuttoned, revealing the soft map of age and time etched into his chest. He examined the faint scar near his collarbone, remnants from a march long ago, a baton swing that hadn't cared about names or titles. He traced it with a reverent finger, remembering the heat of the pavement, the taste of blood mixed with tear gas, the cries of bodies falling beside him not in war, but in protest. Today had stirred all of that from the depths. He wasn't surprised by the gun, nor the fear in the officer's eyes. Monroe took no podium. He never needed one. He sat instead at the head of a long folding table, resting his hands on the smooth surface. The murmur softened into silence. "I don't sit here today as a judge," he said, voice low but unflinching. "I sit here as a man, a father, a son of this soil, a son of this soil. And yesterday, I almost became another chalk outline in the memory of this country." He let that settle, not for dramatic effect, but because silence was sometimes the only language that could carry the weight of truth. He spoke then of what it felt like to have dignity treated like danger, to have history cornered by instinct. He didn't vilify the officer by name. He didn't have to. The issue wasn't a man. It was a system, a pattern, a slow-dripping poison that had soaked into the bones of their institution. Monroe listened, not out of generosity, but out of obligation to the future. He told him the truth, that a single conversation wouldn't erase the harm, that trust, once cracked, took lifetimes to mend. But he also told him that if he was ready to do more than feel sorry, if he was ready to listen, to unlearn, to speak up in rooms where silence was comfort, then perhaps there was a place for him on the long road ahead. They parted without ceremony. No handshake, no dramatic closure. Just two men walking away in opposite directions under the same rising sun, carrying the burden of a moment that had changed them both. The news spread beyond the borders of their small town, reaching screens and hearts across the country. National outlets picked up the story, not just because of the footage, but because of what it exposed, how deeply fear and bias still echoed in the hollow places of American institutions. Commentators debated the implications. Panels convened to discuss racial profiling, judicial legacy, and what it meant that a man with such history could still be mistaken for a threat while eating cobbler. But amid the noise, something quieter stirred. Students from local schools began organizing dialogues, using Monroe's words as a foundation. Churches held vigils not just in prayer, but in education. And everywhere, especially in towns like theirs, people began to look differently at the uniforms they once admired without question. Monroe watched it unfold not with pride, but with wary hope, knowing the country had been stirred before, only to settle again when comfort returned. At the precinct, change did not come gently. Officer Croft, in full uniform, stood before a room of fellow officers during mandatory retraining, the first of its kind initiated after the incident. He spoke, not as a scapegoat, but as a mirror. He described that moment in the diner without deflection, naming his fear, his failure, and the dangerous assumptions that had taken root in him long before he wore a badge. Some officers shifted in their seats uncomfortably. Others looked down. But just a few, met his gaze and nodded, as if something in them had cracked open too. Croft didn't preach redemption. He offered responsibility. He joined a task force on bias response, began riding with new recruits not to teach enforcement, but awareness. His shifts grew longer, his work heavier, but for the first time, it felt honest. Judge Monroe stood once again at the Magnolia Grill, this time beside a young boy with wide eyes and skin the color of his own. They sat at the same booth where days before, history had nearly repeated itself in silence. The staff welcomed him, now not just as a regular, but as a symbol, and conversations around him buzzed softly with recognition and quiet reverence. The boy asked questions about the law, about the badge, about what it meant to be seen and still feared. Monroe answered each gently, guiding him not toward bitterness, but clarity. Their table held more than food. It held legacy, survival, and the fragile thread of hope that the next generation might inherit something better than wound. On the courthouse steps weeks later, Monroe was surprised by applause. Students, officers, neighbors gathered not to celebrate a man, but to acknowledge a moment that changed them all. Croft stood at the edge of the crowd, not in uniform, but present. Their eyes met once more, no longer strained by guilt or tension, but recognition. The arc was not complete, but it had bent, slightly, stubbornly, toward something just. What began as a casual lunch in a quiet southern town transformed into an unflinching mirror, reflecting the state of justice in America. Judge Monroe, a man forged through fire and resistance, was nearly erased by a moment's fear, a hesitation rooted not in law, but in prejudice. Yet what makes this story unforgettable is not just the trauma it exposed, but the response that followed. We watched a courtroom lion, now elderly, confront not only the barrel of a gun, but the ugly continuity of racial bias that has stalked him all his life. We witnessed a police officer, conditioned by fear, stripped by shame, faced the weight of his actions, not with defiance, but with transformation. Through the pain, a town began to see itself more clearly. Through conversation, confrontation, and truth, they pulled the curtain back on the system that had failed them, again and again. This was more than just a close call. It was a turning point. For Monroe, for Croft. For every student who watched that footage and decided to ask why, for every officer who sat in that retraining session and chose to unlearn, for every black father who walked away from that diner thankful that, this time, the story didn't end in tragedy. The arc of this narrative was not about forgiveness alone. It was about accountability. It was about the tension between legacy and survival. It was about standing in the middle of history and choosing, intentionally, to bend the future toward justice, however slowly, however painfully. In the end, Judge Monroe didn't need a courtroom to change the law that day. He only needed a moment, a stare, and a truth so powerful it cracked through the silence. And when he returned to that diner, with a young boy beside him and dignity still upright in his posture, the message was clear. We are not done, but we are awake, and we are watching. This was not just a story, it was a stand. If it moved you, shook you, made you pause, then let it speak again through your share, your voice, your action. This is A1 Storyteller, where truth demands to be told. Stay tuned, stay awake, and never look away.